The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Doolittle.
And I'm Kate Dudding.
And this is Story by Story.
Celebrating the human spirit.
And we are storytellers.
Yes, indeedy.
And Kate and I have been blessed by a little bit of insight into storytelling, what it is, how do you do it. And we've got acquaintances and friends in many places who do the same thing. And we're going to spend an hour kind of sharing time about storytelling and sharing time with one of our friends and hopefully encouraging you to maybe try to come out and listen to a storytelling program, or better yet, come out and tell a story.
Mm-hmm. Or at least with your family and loved ones.
That's true.
That I know there are questions that I would ask my grandparents and my grandparents if I could. But I didn't start being a storyteller till I was 45, and they were all gone by then. On that, ask now, tell now. There we go.
There's another opportunity, and there's an opportunity because you kind of hear those people that aren't with you in your ear a little bit, and you can actually kind of translate that into a story that may have been kind of the way it would have been back in Northville, Massachusetts, or Brooklyn, and in some ways, that's an active conversation with both those folks and the story, and particularly with your listeners. So be encouraged in all sorts of ways. Mm-hmm. What was the most interesting thing you've done, kind of storytelling-wise, in the last couple of weeks?
Well, I was honored to be part of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Challenge up in Saratoga Springs for the second time.
Whoa!
That it's a big production by Leslie Dana of spoken word and her troupe Shift, which are teenagers. H is humanitarian. But it's so they did spoken word and had somebody acting it out in the middle between them, and they did song. They did a couple of different things.
Wow!
Albert Einstein was with us. That he was very much pro civil rights.
Well, there
turns
you go.
out, and Frederick Douglass was also with us, who said that went to Abraham Lincoln and told him what he wanted, that the Negro troops weren't being treated properly, and subsequently they were. And
I understand it was Frederick Douglass that convinced Lincoln that sending African Americans back to Africa wasn't the best policy. I've heard that, and I've got to do a little bit more research on that, because that would be a good story.
So I told my story of Fatima Knight, the 23-year-old Muslim theology student who, upon hearing that black Christian churches had been burned down in the South in 2015 after the massacre at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. There are just four nouns that's hard for me to put together there. That she decided to raise money to help rebuild the churches, the Christian churches. And she raised $100,000 with help from 2,000 donors.
Wow.
Because she said, I started raising money to give hope in a time of fear and to stand up for those who have suffered injustice, which is Dr. King's message.
Yeah, I would think that
or one of his many.
It's interesting. I was in Saratoga for Martin Luther King's night as well at Cafe Lena, and one of my dear friends who I have not spent enough time with, Reggie Harris, who's a folk singer, and his best friend for 30 years, Ed Greenaway, did a program on Deeper Than Skin, and it was their collective stories. And they both kind of have family roots in the James River Valley of Virginia. One is white, one is black. And I gotta say that the combination of the music and their own narrative was riveting and powerful. And so that's, I wasn't telling, but I was there, and and Reggie lives in Schoharie, and he spends a lot of time on the road, and he says, we got to have coffee. And I says, I'm going to send you an email, and I'm going to give you 30 dates. but anyway, so I come, and I have to do a little plug. My other opportunity in storytelling was being at the open mic that we run up there. I don't always get up there, but it was just an electrifying kind of crowd, very supportive, very great stories, some new tellers, which is always a great thing. So we'll talk about our open mics, but the one at Cafe Lena is special in a lot of ways. They've renovated that space to that historic legend of a place, so it's really even better to listen to entertainment. And there's always an interesting group of people there, so that was my break.
Excellent.
So, and actually, we might, now that I think about Cafe Lena, don't we have one of the instigators of our open mic here with us?
Well, yeah, I was the initial instigator, and I quickly asked for, and who would like to run this now that we have permission to do that?
Now that we have permission to show up, who's going to take it on?
And Christy Keegan was one of the persons who who raised her hand.
I thought you said, who wants cake? And I said, me.
Yes, I was answering a different question. Well, Christy Keegan is our featured teller, our guest today, and she is an accomplished storyteller. I have to say she's a social activist. When I think about you, I think about traveling for some reason, because one of the early conversations we had was about the Volkswagen trip across the country when you were just out of college, and somehow that says a lot about the way you go through life. You just kind of love the journey, and you make things happen when you go, and so it's nice to have you with us.
Why, thank you. Although that trip was in my mid-40s.
Well, you felt like you were 20, didn't you?
Oh, good comeback.
You felt like you were 20. I got to cover up somehow.
No, that was good. Good comeback.
Oh.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Some important phase in your life.
It was definitely an important phase.
Or
in my
between phases or something.
I have to, I'm going to look at you really a lot differently now. No, it wasn't in your 20s, but that's okay. Christy, help us with kind of the beginning of you as a storyteller, because I only know you as a storyteller, and we've had several gigs we've done together that have been more than memorable. Some of them have even been fun, but that's another story.
You remember the gigs from hell is
The
really the
gigs-
only audience is other storytellers.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes.
Although those are often the best. I have to say, so I got separated from my first husband and then divorced in the late 80s. And my family was sort of horrified. I was going to starve to death, despite the fact that I had a job that I loved. But somehow I'd starve to death. And at the time, the thinking was having an MBA would be the answer. I didn't think it was a good answer, but my family thought it was a good answer, and I was being, for once, a relatively good child. So I enrolled at Simmons in their MBA program, and I was working at a graphic design firm in Boston. And so I was kind of juggling these things, going through life single. And the statistics professor, I had to go back and take some math because it had been low these many years since I'd been in a math class. And my statistics professor was driving everybody crazy. It was nightmarish. And people kept dropping out. The attrition was incredible, and so finally a group of us hired a TA. Anyways, to shorten this up, I ended up in graduate school, not really sure why I was there. At the same time, there was enrolled in my graduate program a physician who enrolled in an MBA program because she realized she couldn't become a physician and run her own practice without having an MBA. So she came back from a conference one day and she said, you know that thing you do at the zoo? Because at the time I was volunteering at the zoo as a docent, and I was telling stories about animals, but I was doing it not kind of the way that we do what we do, or not having any idea that other people did this. She said, well, that thing that you do, though, that I've seen you do at the zoo, other people do that. This guy just did this at a conference, and she handed me a bunch of papers. And one of them was something for sharing the fire. And the other was for a workshop with J. O'Callahan, whose name I recognize because I lived in Boston and I adored him. I used to run out of my office and sit in my car and listen to his stories from Pill Hill during my lunch hour. And so I went to his workshop, found myself in the company of some very accomplished tellers. I was the only newbie. It was on a marsh in Marshfield, thinking to myself, wow, I have no idea what these people do, but I'm having a very good time not knowing what I'm doing. And it was the not knowing what I was doing. It was the first time really that I'd been, and I've had a lifetime of not knowing things, but it was the first time I was not knowing something that was taking me in a direction I wanted to go. And so shortly after that, I went to Sharing the Fire.
Which is?
Which is a storytelling conference run by, now called the New England Storytelling, Northeast Storytelling Nest, to remember that, which was then held at Lesley College, which is how long ago this was. Right before, the October before that, though, I ended up in Jonesboro at the National Storytelling Festival, which is an enormous thing in Tennessee, Jonesboro, Tennessee, that happens annually the first weekend in October, where I was completely surrounded by storytelling and watched people who I would later meet and later become colleagues with. So that's kind of how I got here.
Large at Jonesboro means like 10,000 people.
Yes, not a small
Lines
place.
for the couple of dozen porta potties. Think.
Well, there are 4 or 5 circus-type tents
Yes.
where people listen to stories. It's quite
1,000 to 1,500 people sit under each tent.
And I think the most pivotal moment there, at the zoo, was working with a group of animals one day, and a young man came down at the end of my program and said, my grandfather would like to speak to you, please. And I looked up, and sitting on the top dais was a very elderly man, and I went up and sat down next to him, and it turned out he was from Congo. Although he didn't call it that, he had been from the Belgian Congo, had come here when it was Zaire, and it was now Congo. So he said, I'm going to tell you a story from my country about the animals that you just showed us. And he did. And I thought, oh, well, now I'm going to try and give this, even though we were not supposed to anthropomorphize about the animals, it was so beguiling, I couldn't not do it. And so the next day I went back to the zoo and did a terrible rendition, a dreadful rendition of the story that he told, and proceeded to do that for the coming weeks, which is one of the things that the physician had seen me do. And so here I am at Jonesboro, and there's the swapping ground, which is this place that's kind of all piled up with hay, and it's where folks just come, and it's kind of an open mic sort of thing. And so I had this story in my head from him, and I'm going through the book. They have this wonderful book stall, and I find a book called Traveling to Tondo, which is a transliteration of an African tale by Verna Ardema, which I realized in flipping through the pages was the story that he had told me slightly differently. And so I buy the book and I take it and I think, well, maybe now I will do a better job. And I go to the swapping ground and I sit down on the hay, and a young, absolutely gorgeous woman stands up, she couldn't have been any more than maybe 17 or 18, and proceeds to tell the story. Tell that story completely differently than I would ever have told it. And I had this aha moment of every story happens everywhere in the world, maybe simultaneously in different languages with different references, because they're all speaking to the same things in each of us. And it was probably the single most important thing, aha moment I've ever had about storytelling. Right. And I think it's probably propelled and impelled me to tell what I tell and how I tell. Mm-hmm. Because I recognize that for me, the personal is not our own, or my own, but it is the general. And if I can manage to make that happen, I think that's the point for me. So there we go.
That was a pretty.
That was a long way around. Something.
Yes.
But that was a pretty good story about storytelling. Mm-hmm. I would think. I mean,
it's a meta story.
Meta story.
Meta means
yes.
a level on top.
Yep.
It's a story about stories.
I didn't even know it was a meta story, but she's right.
It's just like meta communication, meta story.
It's communication about communication.
That's right.
So it's sort of squared. Sorry.
No, I was right there, because I talk about meta communication all the time.
Well, for those of you listening in on this conversation,
Translate for them.
we
Joe.
very rarely get at this level about storytelling.
So come
Usually-
back next time. It'll be way more fun.
But it's very.
Don't go.
Don't leave us, please.
Well, it's important on another level because it expresses a theory about this art form. And if you don't have a theory about what is so, then you don't test it actively and you don't get the feedback you need against your belief system. So this meta stuff is the essence of actually not only learning to tell a story, but holding the story close enough to get it around you.
That's right.
Okay, so actively knowing that people are people and our experience birth, life, and death. Well, other people's death and then
And then our own.
right, but
Yeah, I'm not volunteering to go
there's a
just
lot of
now.
commonalities, and if you tell your story right, even if it's set over here, it will touch the people who have never been there but have experienced similar things,
I think
or have not. I grew up in a family, and my family never did that. And how can you even get through the day when having that as your history? You know, so. But there's something in common that they can suddenly understand your story by connecting it to theirs.
I think when I think about, I was a very serious nerd child. I was a nerd girl. Hard to believe. Nerd girl. Nerd girl. Yes. And in my nerdiness,
Surrounded, Joe.
I'm surrounded by nerd girls.
I was very earnest, and still, I think storytelling gave me a way to be earnest without being preachy, and that major improvement, I will tell you, everyone in my life would tell you. Although I don't tell stories about the work I do now, I will at some point when I no longer do that work. It does enable me both to hear people's stories and kind of reflect on how they've impacted me, and then to think about how whatever's happened to me has impacted other people. So it is kind of the point.
Kate, we've been talking about storytelling at several levels.
Bring the balloons down. Bring the balloons down. There we go.
I think it may be time for us to ask Christy to tell
I think that's
a story,
wise
don't you think?
comment of yours.
And of course, now you're out there, you're going to listen to this story with a very discerning ear, I know.
Or just
Yes.
enjoy it.
Oh, just shut your eyes, put your feet up, make yourself to home. So let me see. Which one will I tell first? Okay. This doesn't really have a firm title yet, so make up one for me. You can send in your suggestions, and Kate will tally them, and we'll end up with one. It was Christmas Day at the Pine Street Inn, the oldest and largest homeless shelter in Boston, and I was there to serve dinner for the third year in a row. And I was standing inside the doorway of the kitchen holding a large pan of mashed potatoes, waiting for the prayer, because the prayer was my signal to step into the dining room. And this is what I heard. And so on this Christmas Day, I invite you to look inside yourself. And if you like what you see, then dance with it. But if you don't, then I invite you to learn some new steps. And once you have done that, I invite you to look at the world around you. And if you like what you see, well, then dance with it. But if you don't like what you see, well then, I invite you to teach the world some new steps. I was floored. This was not the prayer I was used to. Normally, prayers at the Pine Street Inn on Christmas Day were kind of drive-by blessings by religious luminaries from greater Boston. And you could tell by the way they were dressed, they barely took off their coats, and they were definitely on their way from some very nice religious place to some place much nicer than the place that we were standing at that moment, which was terrazzo floored and tile walled with grills on the windows and dreadful fluorescent lighting. But this guy, this man who delivered that prayer, was not like those people. I could see him at the other end of this long table with probably 70 people total, 35 on each side. And he was dressed in a camel's hair coat with a scarf wrapped twice around his neck, and he was tall and slender, with beautiful silver hair that swept back from his forehead and just touched the top of that scarf. His voice was deep and sonorous and patrician, and I was blown away, not only by what he said, but how it made me feel inside. But I didn't have time to really think about what he said because I had to serve dinner, and so I started. And by the time I was done and we had taken all of the hot food and cold drinks to everybody at the table, it was time to start clearing. And so we did that, and then it was time to take warm pie and hot coffee to everybody. And by the time that was done, it was time to start clearing again. And I really wanted to thank him. I was so surprised when he didn't leave. He actually sat at the end of the table and started talking to the men on either side of him. I'd never seen anybody do that before. Well, finally, at the end of the meal, all the men rose, and they went to go into the next room where they got their Christmas presents, which were socks and underwear and gum and candy for folks who didn't smoke and cigarettes for those who did. Pine Street Inn was not judgy about that kind of thing. And so I put down the pile of plates I had, and I zoomed up to the end of the table where he was, and I touched him on the shoulder. And when he turned around, I stuck out my hand, and I said, I just want to thank you so much for what you said. That was an incredible prayer. It just made me think about things a lot, you know? And he took my hand in both of his, and he shook it. And he looked at me, and he smiled kind of sadly, and he said, well, thank you. I hope it helps. And at that moment, I realized that the two hands that were holding mine were grimy in the creases. His nails were broken. And that camel's hair coat that had looked so good at a remove was actually stained and worn, as was the scarf around his neck. And his hair touched his scarf not out of a fashion statement, but because it needed a haircut, and he was not very well shaven, and he smelled terrible. And I realized that I had just gotten an incredible blessing, a blessing that had mattered so much to me from a homeless man. As he walked off, I turned around and picked up the dishes and tried to wrap my head around this. I come from a do-goody kind of family. We do charity work. We give money to charity. We volunteer for things. I'd certainly seen my mother and my grandmother give money to homeless folks before. But I had always somehow seen it as a from us to them. I had never understood that this was a mutual kind of agreement. And I had certainly never felt like they were going to have something to give me, even though on at least one occasion when I was younger, I'd been saved from a terrible disaster by two homeless guys and a couple of sex workers. But even that had seemed accidental. This was something that pulled me up short. And so that night I drove home, and as I walked into the house for dinner, I smelled this incredible meal that my husband and his two best friends were cooking, and I sat at the table and we ate, and we drank wine, and we laughed. And I thought, I'm looking inside myself, and I don't know that I entirely like what I see. I wasn't quite sure what those new steps were going to be. So fast forward a number of years, I don't know, 4 or 5 or so, and I'm back at the Pine Street Inn on Christmas Day, and it is really cold, the kind of cold that we had here recently, that below zero kind of cold. And normally we'd feed maybe 200 people, maybe 170, but we were on our third seating of 100. And most of the volunteers had to leave, but I didn't, because I had my husband and his best friends at home cooking for me. So I said I would stay, and 3 of us were left to staff this one table. And so while we're running, warm food and hot coffee and cold drinks to people, I noticed there's 3 young men seated at one end of the table, my end. They're in their early 20s, and they're laughing, and they're having a great time. And so I made sure they got seconds, because it was definitely our last seating. We'd already packed up all the food for the van we were going to. And then when it came to pie, we had lots of pie left. And so I gave them seconds at the first seating. And then I had more pie. So I went over. And instead of asking them if they wanted more, I slid into a chair next to them. And I said, so where are you from? They looked at me kind of surprised. And then two of them said, in concert, from Queens. I said, Queens, where? Well, Bayside. Where in Bayside? 125th Street. Well, I grew up in the corner of Valley Pine Park, and where'd you go to school? And we proceeded to have the kind of conversation that I, and probably you, and I'm sure you, have had with people in subways and trains and airports and new neighbors and colleagues. The kind of conversation you have with anybody that I didn't know you could have with homeless people. And so finally, they were kind of done, and I looked around and said, well, I better get back to work, and they're going to fire me. And everybody laughed, and I picked up the dishes, and I went back into the kitchen. And then I stepped into the dining room one more time to see if I'd forgotten anything. The three young men were standing at the end of the table, and one of them beckoned me over. And when I got there, he said, we want to give you something. And I thought inside myself, you can't give me a present. I mean, you're homeless. What could you possibly have to give me? Besides, I should be giving you something. But I didn't say that. I said, thanks. And so this young man took a bag, maybe this wide, and this deep and this high, and he unrolled the top. And out of it, he took a beautiful crocheted scarf, and he handed it to me. I looked at it, and I shook it out, and I wrapped it around my neck, and I tied it. I thanked him again. And then I hugged all three of them, and they left, and they went to get their Christmas presents. And on my way home that night, I thought about how incredibly lucky I was to be able to receive something in a way I thought wasn't possible.
Wow.
It's my new favorite story to tell. It reminds me of what I don't know.
Unexpected Christmas gifts?
Oh, I like that one. That's good. Thank you.
That can be the working one for now.
Thank you.
I have day, dinner, and surprises of what I,
I was just going to.
That was good.
I was going to just say mutual stories
Oh.
because you've got mutual gifts. I know. Wow.
But it does. It reminds me of what I don't know and reminds me that I have to stay open to what I don't know. Which is a long list of things, I suspect. A very long list. So I don't know where we are for time. So you
Well,
Well, we have just a few minutes before the halfway point where we go to.
let me ask you one question about the story. And I think before we started the broadcast, we were talking about, sometimes it takes time for a story to percolate. And, this one must have happened somewhere around the before you went on your trip.
Yes.
So it's a story from your past, and you tell it and it's so fresh. How does that happen?
Part of how it happens, I think, was I served meals at the Pine Street Inn for the better part of 8 years, and for 6 of those, I did it once every 2 months with a youth group at my church. And so the physical plant of how it was then, I know it's had a lot of renovations, I'm sure I'd be surprised if I went back, but the physical plant of it is incredibly real to me because it was like a second home. I also lived about 6 blocks from the Pine Street Inn, and for a period of time went out on the van at night, so I was in and out of the kitchen a lot. So that part of Boston and that building are very, very real to me, incredibly real. One of the things that I took my youth group for about a year and a half, and then we had a debriefing after one meal, and the kids said, "Can we bring our parents?" Oh, yes, you can.
Oh, yeah.
And, it was a nice suburb, and these were, well-educated folk who had never been in the Pine Street Inn, and the kids were really right to have done that, and we did. And one of the people we brought was my former husband, who was kind of a middle manager in a big company, type A, and just off and running. And so we get done, and he helps cook, and he helps serve, and our son, who had already figured out that he could just go out and play checkers with people, he had figured out long before I did exactly where it was people lived and where to meet them. So then we went on a tour with the director, and I remember my husband saying, well, who cleans this place? And the director saying, the people who live here. He said, well, who manages the place? And Rich said, well, I'm the director, and we have a cook we pay, and mostly it's the people who live here. And all of that experience, I think, is what informs the story. I have to say, as I traveled cross-country, I had started telling, and I did some storytelling in shelters and have worked in residential programs. So I spent a lot of time with people who are in places like that. Yeah.
Well,
so it's very real to me. I also once stayed in a homeless shelter just to see what it would be like. I stayed for a week in North Carolina because I wanted to know what it felt like to be on the other end. And that, I think, definitely informed how I do this.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
That's a story, but not one I'll tell you now.
yeah.
You have a CD of
I have a CD probably of stories about this. I do have a number of pieces about this.
the street corner saviors and
Yeah. And there's another piece about my
help from the
Yeah.
homeless. I don't know. But people you may not have met. I don't know. But
One of the things I didn't say in the story, because I forgot to, because sometimes this happens, is when I found the director of volunteers, who was also a volunteer, I asked her who that gentleman had been who'd given the prayer. And he had been an attorney with a very successful practice, and a wife and children. And his wife and children had been killed in an automobile accident. And he'd begun to drink. And he had lost his practice. And he had lost his house. He had lost his family and friends. And he had been a guest of the inn at the time that I met him for a number of years. And he came and went. They didn't know where he went when he went, but he came back. And when he was there on Christmas, he would deliver a prayer, always different. And it was really illustrative for me that you don't know who can end up there. And so...
when you said, I hope it helps you, it's like, I haven't
Yeah.
found what can help me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was that look on his face. It was that look. I should also say that my interest in the Pine Street Inn came about. I was working for the Mass Association for Mental Health as a policy associate, and my younger sister, one of my two younger sisters who was profoundly mentally ill, went missing on the West Coast. And Rich Ring, who's the director of the Pine Street Inn, helped me connect with every homeless shelter on the West Coast until I found her.
Wow.
And I know full well how little it takes for somebody to end up in a place like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well,
Well,
And yet it is my favorite story to tell because I find it a piece that no matter where I am, I'm going to be able to talk to somebody. No, where I am, there's going to be someone who will care about me because I feel like no matter where I am, there's going to be someone I can care about. And I do really see that as a conjoined, reciprocal state of affairs.
The one thing we share with the viewers is that this story is an example of being able to relate on fairly deep levels without getting too encumbered by it. And that's an important element of the way story works. And the other bit of reference that I would share with you is there's a resonance that happens during storytelling. There's a thing that you begin to relate to what Christy's saying because somewhere in your life similar things have happened to you. And you may even forget you're listening to her because you're processing that memory in your own mind, that story. And we think that's one of the special aspects of storytelling that's different than stage theater and it's different than the TV and things like that. So thank you for that great example of resonance.
And it was almost 25 years before I told that story in public because it was very personal. I told it at conferences and I told it to friends. I told it endlessly to friends to work it as a piece. But I really wanted it to be so comfortable for me to tell it. And now I love it. So now I love telling it. It was very emotional in the beginning and I wouldn't have been able to to do it with an audience and not have the audience have to take care of me, which wasn't what I wanted. I wanted them to really
Well,
love it too.
preaching is one thing to avoid. You don't
Yes.
want your audience as your therapy group.
Not at all.
That's another end of the spectrum you don't want to go to.
No.
Actually, what we really would like to hear now, Kate, is what we got coming up in the community
Yes, what's coming
vis-a-vis
up?
storytelling.
Oh, what a good idea.
A
Joe.
good idea.
Well, actually, as part of the Winter Storytellers series, the 10th one offered by Academy for Lifelong Learning in Saratoga Springs, you can hear Christy Keegan on February 7th at noon at the 2 Union Avenue, part of the Empire State College, in the big room. Just say you're here for the storytelling, and they'll tell you go to the right. Animal stories.
Except it won't be.
No.
It will be half animal stories and half something else to be decided soon.
You know some half animals?
You know, some mongrels. Oh,
Yes. And there'll be the 2 following Wednesdays, there will also be storytelling by Siri Allison and by TBD.
to be
I know.
Timothy Bain Davis is
Yes,
supposed to say.
right. And the last Wednesday is a snow date, which we haven't had to use yet, so that's that.
Frosty is the teller on that day.
Right.
Ah,
And then on Friday is back in Albany at the Irish American Heritage Museum will be Claire Beetlestone. It's Friday, February 9th at 7 p.m. And stories that she gathered when she lived in Scotland.
right, it's of the Celtic sea god, and it's Lair MacLet, and he's an interesting character in that old ancient Celtic myth, and Claire is quite a person in her own right, and she has acquired the Scottish lilt to her
Yes.
accent, and the whole combination is just wonderful when she starts to tell.
And then 2 days after that, in Schenectady, at Proctor's on the 2nd floor in the Fenimore Gallery, will be a program called
Revelation.
Revelations. Revelations. It says so right here. February 11th, 2 p.m., just as the Green Market closes, with not Christy Keegan, but we have a wealth of storytellers in the area. Betty Cassidy, Janet Carter, Margaret French, Marnie Gillard, Nancy Marie Payne, Sandy Schumann, and Siri Allison.
Good lineup. Good
Yes.
lineup.
Yes.
And there will be things revealed probably.
Yes,
during that.
yes, indeedy. And Sandy will be the MC because Joe and I will be elsewhere.
That's right.
Then a few days later on St. Valentine's Day, February 14th, will be the Saratoga Storytelling Open Mic. It alternates between Cafe Lena and Woodlawn Commons, which is behind Hospice on Clement Street. It's free when it's there. At Cafe Lena, it's a modest price. So that's an open mic. Listeners are welcome.
And there's cookies and punch.
Then the Story Circle of the Capital District has a meeting on Wednesday, February 21st at the Pine Hills Branch Library in Albany, 6:15 to 9, where we share stories under development. I've developed a lot of stories there. You can get as much or as little feedback as you want, or you can just come as a listener, because storytellers need listeners. Storytellers love listeners.
listeners.
We love
Otherwise, we're just
listeners.
telling to an empty room, and people think you're
Talking to yourself. Yeah.
Yes, no. So, please think about that. And then to end off the month, on Wednesday, February 28th, the Interfaith Story Circle program, which is part of withourvoice.org, is having a program, The Tent of Abraham, the power of story to encourage the gifts of hospitality. The Tent of Abraham was open on all 4 sides, so travelers, no matter where they were from, could come and be welcomed. It starts with a vegetarian potluck supper at 6:15. Storytelling starts at 7:15. And the guest tellers will be from 3 different religions: Sandy Schumann, Jewish, Bill Roylance, Christian, and Dr. Musrat Chowdhury, Muslim. I was going, wait a second, are we doing the adjective or the noun? So I was going, Islam or Muslim, which is it? So at the Dominican Retreat and Conference Center on Route 7, just as the crosstown starts, or ends.
In Niskayuna.
In Niskayuna, yes, thank you. And just want to mention that the Interfaith Story Circle is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. 25 years of connecting people through story. Started by Gert Johnson, who was a member of both the Interfaith Story Circle and Story Circle of the Capital District. She felt if people of faith heard each other's stories, they would find out how much they had in common.
Certain logic to that.
Yes. And if you can't get to any of these, or you're just dying for a story, come see our YouTube channel. You can access it via storycircle@proctors.org by clicking on YouTube. You can get over 200 stories on demand, most of them recorded right here in the studio in Colonie Town Library.
Wow. That was a
Drum roll, please.
We have 18 more minutes, guys.
18 minutes. Whew. Do you have another little story you could share?
I'm sorry, did you just meet me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Remember, let's see, in the last story, she mentioned one story. I think only one, but maybe there was another one in there.
Oh, there's always, yes,
Yes.
there's always more in here somewhere. Let's see. So, I'm so not used, by the way, I have to say, I'm not used to telling sitting down. This is the only time I ever tell
That's
sitting
right.
down is when I'm here. And it's difficult because not only was I a nerd as a child, but probably also hyperactive. So here I'm making an effort.
And we appreciate it.
Thank you. And I appreciate being here. So, Ruby and I had been on the road for close to 2.5 months. Actually, we'd been on the road for close to 1.5 years, but this particular segment, we'd been living in a tent in the mountains of Colorado above Durango for about 2 months. And suddenly I wanted to come back east more than anything. And so I packed up my camping gear. The snow was about to fly in Colorado anyway, and we headed down the back of the Rockies and across Kansas and found ourselves finally, at the end of quite a long drive, in Indiana, when I desperately just needed to walk. And so Ruby and I poured ourselves out of two sides of the car and began to walk. Ruby was my rescued Doberman Pinscher. And as we walked along, I reflected at how much she had changed in the year and some since I had rescued her. When I'd gotten her, she was emaciated and skinny and skittish, and she was missing hair, and she'd had scars all the way down her back and her sides, and her nails were broken, and so was her spirit. But as we walked through this little park, and I watched her walk next to me, I couldn't help but admire what she looked like, which was a fully muscled, glistening, dark red Doberman Pinscher who pranced on her little feet, but also marveled at her spirit, which had returned with a will and that she carried all around her. The park was beautiful. It was this long, green sort of swath of lawn, and there was a little hill at the end and a copse of deciduous trees at the top that cast just enough shade I could imagine lying down and not doing anything for a while if we got that far. And there was a little stream that ran along this side and a sprinkling of trees over here. We walked along and I just concentrated on stretching. Ruby did the same, and I wasn't worried. She wasn't on a leash. She wasn't going to leave me. And she wandered a little bit further than usual, and every once in a while she'd stop and crop a little clump of green grass that was left in the late summer kind of brown grass. And every once in a while she'd flip over on her back and do that thing that dogs do when they're really happy. We got about halfway across this patch of grass, and I saw coming out of the trees at the top of that hill a little boy running straight down the hill. And he had blonde hair that was kind of flopping around his head, and he had on a little polo shirt and shorts and sneakers, and his little legs were kind of wheeling, and his arms were waving, and I could hear him yelling something, but I wasn't really sure what it was. And to be truthful, I didn't pay any attention to him because he wasn't my problem. And I kept walking. We went a little bit further, and I looked over, and Ruby was a little bit further than she usually was, but she looked at me, and I knew she knew where I was, and I wasn't worried. Then This time I was a little bit closer to the bottom of the hill, and I could hear the little boy. Bufada! Bufada! He was yelling, which wasn't anything I recognized, but he was blonde and fair with reddish cheeks, and I assumed it must be some sort of Eastern European language, maybe. But I didn't pay any attention to him because he wasn't my problem. And a little further along, I noticed a woman, very, very pregnant woman, coming out of the trees at the top of the hill, and she too was not so much running down the hill as making an effort not to tumble down it because her stomach was definitely way ahead of her. And she was yelling his name, which I could now hear. David! David, stop! I tracked David and realized he was on a straight collision course for my dog. Now, I have to tell you that Ruby loved children. She was incredible. She had passed a good canine citizenship test. She could be trusted with anybody, but I wasn't really sure what my big Doberman Pinscher would do in a collision course with a small 4 or 5-year-old child, so I began to run. Not much more gracefully than the woman coming down the hill. That little boy rolled up on the tips of his sneakers. He stuck his arms out and he flew through the air, a mini Superman, and suddenly he wrapped his arms around Ruby's neck, his legs around her torso, and down they went. I slid the last 2 feet on my knees. Oh, God, please. Not sure which of them I was more worried about. But when I looked around, I started to laugh. He was holding her neck and kissing her. Bufada! Kiss, bufada! Kiss her ears, her muzzle, her nose, her mouth, her neck. Bufada! Bufada! Kiss, kiss, kiss. She was licking as good as she was getting kissed anytime she could actually get her tongue out of her mouth enough to do it. By now, the woman had sunk down on her knees next to us, and she was crying. Oh, no, she's fine. I said, don't worry, he's fine, and she's fine. No harm done. You don't understand, she said. We've wanted David to get a dog for so long, and he's always been afraid of them. And look at this. He's been so afraid. We thought if he had a dog as a friend when he went to school, then if the kids made fun of him, it wouldn't be so bad for him. I took a closer look. David had Down syndrome. I understood exactly what she meant. One of my sisters had challenges so visible to the outside world, it made it easy for them to make fun of her. Well, he doesn't seem to be afraid of this dog, I said. And so Laura, which was her name, and David and Ruby and I sat on that grass for quite some time that afternoon, for hours. And I taught David every single command that I had taught Ruby. I taught him how to make her lie down and sit and roll over and high five and shake. He was brilliant. It's actually really easy to work with kids with Down syndrome. They tend to be a little black and white, and so he got it down perfectly, and Ruby responded to him as if she'd been working with him forever. And I talked to Laura about what it took to train a dog like Ruby. And then it was time to say goodbye. And so Ruby and I got into the car and rolled down the windows. Before we pulled away, Laura, what does bufada mean? Oh, Laura said, it means beautiful dog. Bufada, beautiful dog, 2 words I never thought I'd heard him say. Bye, David. Bye, Laura. Bufada. Bufada. And so Ruby and I headed back east. About a year later, I got a phone call from Laura, who I hadn't been expecting to hear from. We'd exchanged numbers, but it hadn't really seemed likely we'd stay in touch. They had, in fact, gotten a dog. They'd gotten not a puppy, which would have been way too much for somebody who was, when I met her, close to 8 months pregnant. They'd gotten a mature dog. They'd gone to a trainer. They'd had school every day with the dog. David had taught her all the commands I had taught him and more. He'd even taught her to pick up toys. Oh, and David was the most popular boy in his kindergarten class because he was the only 5-year-old who could make his very own full-grown Doberman lie down sit, roll over, high five, and shake hands. Boofada.
Oh, I love that story.
I love that.
I love that story.
And I just heard that a couple weeks ago, and I'm going, oh, I get to hear it again.
It is my husband's favorite story. He will always say, "We still boofada, honey." I'm doing a historical. No, do boofada. But it is a testimony to the recovery of spirit, if there ever was one. And
A lot of spirit.
yeah, and I miss her all the time. I have a dog who I adore, who in many ways reminds me of Ruby, but Ruby is my guiding principle for, there's many, what would you so-and-so do? Mine is what would Ruby do? And in general, she would welcome you with open arms, give you a kiss in return for one. So
The other thought I had earlier, and I kind of live and espouse this, but the line is coincidence. Stopping at a park in Indiana is God's way of remaining anonymous.
yeah,
And you can do a whole series and get any group talking about the coincidences in their lives that have made a difference, that they were surprised when they happened and have had a lasting effect. So that's one of them.
it was a crapshoot. I was going to pull into a bland drive-by hotel, and I thought, no, I need to move.
Yeah.
I thought, do you know what Ruby Keegan's middle name is?
Boofada! 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 There's a little corollary
That's
to that.
4-year-old for
Boofada! It's a little corollary to that story. Is the day before this, it had, we were in Kansas and it had a weird hailstorm. Despite the warm weather, and then this pouring rain, and then the sun came out, and we had stopped at a kind of a roadside restaurant sort of thing, and when we got out of the car, there was a nest of birds who had fallen out of a tree, and Ruby went over, kind of scooped them up in her mouth, and brought them to me, and I was able to actually put the nest back up and then put the babies back up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which I thought was, since she ate virtually every rodent she ever got in her mouth, that was actually, I thought, pretty amazing. So, she had bird friends. She had a cockatiel friend and she had parrot friends, so she knew the difference. So.
And you don't eat your friends.
Don't eat your friends. It's tacky. Don't eat your friends.
Oh, well, you've led a very interesting life, and I must say.
I've been lucky.
Yes.
I've been lucky in my coincidences. That's
Coincidences, right? Coincidences. And people might be interested in what you do professionally. Because
What's your day job?
What's your day job?
Another coincidence, actually. So I arrived back here. I don't know where I'm actually going, but I'm going to visit a friend in Schuylerville, and the tie rod on my car broke as I got off the thruway to come through Schenectady. So I was out of money. I needed a job, and I got a series of strange jobs, briefly, a horse farm and a couple of others, and then ended up being a finance person at a not-for-profit who wanted somebody to run groups. And so I went to what was then called Domestic Violence and Rape Crisis Services, Saratoga County, to get training in running groups for victims of domestic violence. And I liked the people there so much that I became a volunteer for their agency, and a year later they asked if I would run their shelter. So they're now called Wellspring, but I'm a legal advocate for Domestic Violence and Rape Crisis Agency that serves all of Saratoga County, as well as sexual assault victims in Washington County. Yeah. So that's my day job.
That's your day job.
My day job.
Yeah.
In which, actually, I hear a lot of stories that make me reflect on my life, but I also work with people to reframe their own stories. For anyone who's going through transition, storytelling is not just something you do for the public, it's something you do all the time. And for many of the people that I meet, the men and women that I meet, their ability to get through what they've gotten through and rewrite their story and then go on is pretty inspiring. Very. Yeah.
I had a little of this. I was working at a place and I felt I had been treated very, very unfairly, and I got clinically depressed. And I got some drugs because my brain chemistry was all mucked up. Yeah, through an MD, okay, not tough. and I had a therapist, and she said, "Has all your time at this place been horrible?" I went, "Oh, no, it's just the last 20%." And it was like, right, 80% really was good. Okay, and that helped. That was like a little turning point. Coming out of the depression.
Asking people to remind themselves of where they have been before, of what has been different, of where they've had agency. It's how we coach each other when we do that, and I think it's not really different than when you work with anybody who's been a victim of trauma. You invite them to imagine there has been something else, and can they connect with that something else, which then becomes the point of storytelling. So. Yet another gift.
Yet another tale.
Yeah, yet another tale.
Wow.
So,
well, this has been a far-ranging program. We never know what we're going to. We don't expect anything. Maybe that's why you look at it.
And we certainly don't prep for it.
No, I always expect something wonderful, but I don't know what it's going to be specifically.
And I think this afternoon is certainly wonderful and gives you a good idea of kind of both the nature, and I was going to say the power of story, but it's the influence. Because when you think about your favorite teacher, you'll say, well, he told us really good stories, or he made things simple, he made things clear. And in that regard, you're really using influence, you're not using power. And I think that's one of the other fabrics of storytelling.
But you've taken us places you've taken me places I've never been. And I really don't know anybody with Down syndrome. But now I know, you never know what their gifts are.
That's right.
Do not write them off.
That's right.
Let's see what's what. And the homeless shelter, they're without the grace of whatever.
Right.
Yeah. An interesting fact, when I first started volunteering there, the director told me that most of their donations came in $5 and $10 checks from people who were one paycheck away from living there, because for them it was easy to understand what it would be like and how they could get there. And now, given the cost of housing and a variety of other things, I think it is an even more prevalent issue.
There's an echo of some of the stories of Schenectady, where had a friend who was a down-and-out minister, long story, and got hired between our church and the city mission, and his job was to keep this homeless people out of the doors of the shops in Schenectady. And as it turned out, he began to do things that engaged everybody. And they came up with an idea. It's now called the ambassadors. But the men from the city mission had special jackets and ambassadors, and he matched them with a person from the burbs as another volunteer. And you'd go out on the streets and have a flashlight for people. You'd open the door at Proctor's. You'd do all these things. And it was a great relief because people knew there were people around who were going to be helpful. And it's now a big going concern in part of the world. And some of those ambassadors have become full-time employees of Proctor's doing other jobs.
And on that, we have to say goodbye. We have 8 seconds.
Bye.
Thank you, Christy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Savor the stories.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round